The red you see on your screen right now, that specific red, exists because of an element called europium. Without it, screens can't produce that color. Not well, at least. And europium is just one of 17 elements you've almost certainly never thought about. Elements with names that sound like they belong in a fantasy novel. Lanthanum, praseodymium, gadolinium. You can't name them, but every piece of technology you depend on needs them to function. And for the better part of 2 decades, one country has controlled nearly all of their production. What happened when that country decided to turn off the tap is a story that should concern anyone who owns a phone, drives a car, or expects the lights to stay on. I'm the voice behind Object Origins, where we trace the hidden materials and histories behind the objects that shape modern life. This is Rare Earth Elements Explained, not as a chemistry lesson, but as a geopolitical reality most people have no idea they're living inside. By the end of this, you'll understand why 17 obscure metals sit at the center of a power struggle that affects every industry on the planet, and why the solution is far more complicated than just opening a new mine. Here's what makes rare earth elements strange. They're not rare. That's the first thing people get wrong, and it matters. They exist in the Earth's crust in reasonable abundance. Cerium, the most common of the group, is roughly as plentiful as copper. The name rare earth comes from 18th century mineralogy, when they were difficult to isolate from the ores they hid inside. The problem was never scarcity, it was concentration. These 17 elements, the 15 lanthanides plus scandium and yttrium, don't form large, easily mineable deposits the way iron or gold sometimes can. They're dispersed, scattered thinly through rock, mixed together in mineral formations where separating one from another requires intensive chemical processing. And that distinction between rare and hard to get is what makes this entire story possible. Because once you extract them, these rare earth minerals do things no other elements can. Neodymium magnets are the strongest permanent magnets known. They're in every smartphone speaker, every pair of earbuds, every hard drive, every electric vehicle motor, every wind turbine generator. Europium and terbium produce the red and green phosphors in display screens. Scandium strengthens aluminum alloys for aerospace applications. Cerium goes into catalytic converters. Lanthanum into camera lenses and battery electrodes. Erbium amplifies signals in fiber optic cables. Strip these elements from modern technology, and what you have left is not a slightly worse version of the same technology. What you have left is nothing. Now, if these elements aren't actually rare, a reasonable question follows. Why doesn't every country just mine their own? And the answer is one of the most important details in this entire story. Mining rare earth elements is an environmental nightmare. The ores that contain them often also contain thorium and uranium, radioactive byproducts that contaminate soil and groundwater. The chemical separation process uses enormous volumes of acids and solvents, producing toxic waste at a scale that's difficult to overstate. For every ton of rare earth oxide produced, the process can generate thousands of gallons of acidic wastewater and significant amounts of radioactive material. Quick note, these environmental figures vary by site and method, and exact numbers are debated, but the broad pattern is well documented across independent research. Through the 1960s and 70s, the United States was actually the world's leading producer of rare earth minerals, centered at a single mine, Mountain Pass in the Mojave Desert of California. But environmental regulations tightened, costs climbed, and meanwhile, China was building something unprecedented. Starting in the 1980s and accelerating through the 90s, China invested systematically in rare earth mining and processing, particularly in Inner Mongolia, at operations near Baotou. The strategy was deliberate and long-term. Chinese operations could undercut competitors on price, partly through lower labor costs, partly through less stringent environmental enforcement, and partly through direct state support. The economics were brutal for everyone else. Mountain Pass couldn't compete. It shut down in 2002. By 2010, China controlled roughly 97% of global rare earth production. Not 97% of reserves. Reserves exist across multiple continents. 97% of production. The mines, the processing plants, the separation facilities, the supply chains, nearly all of it ran through one country. And I want to be clear about something. This wasn't a conspiracy. It was visible, it was gradual, and it was largely ignored. Country after country watched it happen and calculated that buying from China was cheaper than building their own capacity. The dependency grew year by year, and almost nobody treated it as a strategic concern. until it became one. In September 2010, a territorial dispute erupted between China and Japan over islands in the East China Sea. A Chinese fishing trawler collided with Japanese Coast Guard vessels. Japan detained the captain. And then, though China officially denied implementing a formal embargo, shipments of rare earth elements to Japan slowed dramatically. Within weeks, reports emerged that Chinese customs officials were holding rare earth exports at ports, not just to Japan, but restricting outflows more broadly. The market response was immediate and severe. Prices for some rare earth elements increased tenfold within months. Neodymium, essential for the magnets in everything from electric motors to missile guidance systems, saw prices spike that made manufacturing projections meaningless overnight. The technology metals that industries had taken for granted as cheap and available suddenly weren't available at any price. Japan, the world's largest importer of rare earths for its electronics and automotive sectors, faced the possibility of production lines going silent. Defense planners across multiple countries started asking questions that should have been asked a decade earlier. And Mountain Pass, that shuttered mine in the California desert, emergency efforts began to restart it. It eventually reopened under new ownership. But reopening a mine is not the same as rebuilding a supply chain. Processing infrastructure, separation technology, specialized workforce. China had spent decades developing what other nations let atrophy. The 2010 crisis triggered exactly the kind of global reaction you'd expect. Australia accelerated development at Mount Weld. Greenland's vast deposits attracted interest from mining companies and foreign governments alike. Deposits across sub-Saharan Africa entered exploration phases. The United States declared critical minerals a national security priority. But here's the part that makes this story uncomfortable rather than reassuring. Building rare earth mining and processing capacity takes years, often a decade or more, from exploration to production. Environmental review, permitting, construction, chemical processing facilities, workforce training, and even where new mines have opened, China still dominates the midstream processing, the refining and separation stage where raw ore becomes usable material. Having the ore in the ground is not the same as having the supply chain to turn it into neodymium magnets or europium phosphors. Worth keeping in mind, the rare earth geopolitics landscape does shift. New projects come online, trade policies evolve, and recycling technologies are developing. The percentages I have described reflect a broad trend, not a fixed and permanent situation, but the structural dependency remains significant. So the scramble continues, and it's a scramble that hasn't produced anything close to balance. There are 17 elements on the periodic table that most people will never think about. They have names that resist memory and properties that resist substitution. And they sit inside every critical technology you interact with: the phone, the car, the medical equipment, the energy grid, the defense systems. That's the reality of rare earth elements explained in terms that go beyond chemistry. This is about who controls the materials that make modern life function. The red on your screen is still europium. The magnets in your earbuds are still neodymium, and the supply chains behind them are still, overwhelmingly, running through one country. That hasn't changed. It's just that now, more people are starting to notice. If this is the kind of story that makes you look at ordinary objects differently, subscribe. There's more on the channel that goes deeper into the materials and histories hiding inside the things you use every day. And if this one landed for you, a like genuinely helps it reach more people.